Recently, a wave of royal fever hit Zambia, and I was hit harder than most. His Royal Highness Prince Harry came to visit, and ordinarily in such situations, I try to exude a certain nonchalance about celebrities. They don't pay my bills, I don't know them personally, and to what benefit are they really? Except for Beyonce, of course. Yeah. But in this case, I found myself on social media trawling for more stories about Prince Harry. Where would he be? What would he be doing? Would he be kissing babies, opening hospitals? What was it? All of this in spite of the fact that I work in conservation, and so I know that Prince Harry is the president of African Parks, a large organization that do some very exciting work in Zambia. And so I knew that if Prince Harry was in Zambia, it probably had something to do with this. And yet, I was filled with excitement and glee when I saw this headline. Prince Harry was offering to give our country 1,000 elephants. And so I did what any decent millennial would do in such a situation. I went to Twitter. For two reasons. I wanted to know what my people were saying, and also I wanted some comedic relief. And I must admit, on both counts, I was not disappointed. This Twitter user wanted to know why Prince Harry was offering to help Zambians with elephants. This Twitter user, who I assume is some sort of businessman, wanted to know how much an elephant costs. And this Twitter user, I think, sums up what a lot of people were thinking. Why would you give Zambians something they already have? And as amusing as these tweets are, for me, they speak to a problem that I think we have. There is a huge disconnect between what's going on in our protected areas, our national parks, and what the general public thinks. And I believe there's many reasons for this, but one of them is how we absorb information and how we retain it. If you've ever tried to cram for a test last minute, you know that there is no point in trying to stuff information into your head if you don't understand it. And so I have a little exercise for us to do to prove my point. I'm going to state 3 facts about wildlife in Zambia. And by show of hands, I need you to tell me if you knew these were facts before I stated them. Fact number 1. In the 1960s, Zambia had about 250,000 elephants. Fast forward to the year 2015, and Zambia now has 20,000, thereabout. If you're good at math, you will have calculated that's a population drop of 90% in about 5 decades. Who knew this? Show of hands. Okay. Second fact. In the 1970s, Zambia had a wildlife population, where rhinos are concerned, of about 12,000. Fast forward to 1998, Zambia now has a rhino population of 0. Who knew this? Now, what happened to the elephants and to the indigenous black rhinos that Zambia had? Well, both of them predominantly were poached for the illegal wildlife trade, because there are places in the world, like Far East Asia, where ivory and rhino horn are in high demand. Ivory, because you can carve things out of it and you can show wealth, and rhino horn, because there are places in the world where people believe that rhino horn can cure things like cancer. Now, I must state, this is not true. To illustrate this, I'll explain that rhino horn is made of keratin, a protein, the same protein that your fingernails and your hair are made of. If this were the case, I think my mani-pedis would cost a lot more than what they do now. Another fact. Recently, the Department of National Parks and Wildlife and WWF Zambia partnered to look at a special animal, the Kapua lechwe. Now, some of you might know that the Kapua lechwe is exciting for many reasons, one of them being that you can only find it here in Zambia, nowhere else in the world. And WWF and the Department of National Parks and Wildlife found that in 5 years, that population had dropped by 19%. Now, unlike with elephants and rhinos, where the market for the products is in a faraway place, the Kafue lechwe is mostly poached for our own consumption. Because who here can say that they've not sat around a table and seen someone serve bushmeat, whether they consumed it or not? So we can take full credit for this population drop. Who knew that the Kafue lechwe had a population drop of 19% in 5 years? Now, how is it that you don't know this? You're a very educated group of people. You watch television, you listen to the news. If you're like me, you're on Twitter scrolling for random facts. How is it that a group of such learned minds does not know this? I think it has something to do with the way we think about wildlife crime and poaching. See, when we think about poaching, we often think about men like this. They are poor, they live in villages, they live next to protected areas like national parks, and they poach not because they're inherently evil and they want to see all wildlife dead, but because they are trying to feed their families. They want to put food on the table, and they want their kids to go to school. And we can understand that, because who here wouldn't do something bad for ultimate good? And so in their communities, men like this might even be considered to be heroes. But of course, internationally, they're villains who are stripping Africa of its beautiful wildlife and ruining things for everyone. But I'd like you to think of poachers like this, not as heroes or as villains, but rather as pawns in a much bigger game, a game that they have no real control over. So this pawn might feel good about himself. He might think he's doing something to make his life better, but ultimately, he is just a pawn. And the thing about pawns is they're dispensable. If he gets arrested, if he ends up getting shot, you'll just replace him. And so what I'd like us to think about today is the illegal wildlife trade. The trade in things like ivory, rhino horn, bushmeat, and many other products, and how it's a lot more complex than we like to think about it. Because ultimately, this trade is not driven by poverty, but by greed. And the problem with greed is enough is never enough. But I know that these are hard concepts to understand, especially when we think about things like ivory, because how many of us have seen an elephant? How many of us have actually touched rhino horn? And yes, we've eaten bushmeat, but we don't know where it was coming from, so can we really relate? So let's talk about something which all of us can relate to. Pizza. It's a Friday night, you're about to start binge watching that show you love so much, and you hear a knock on the door. You open and there's a delivery man handing you a warm pizza, and the smell wafts to your nose. And although you hand this man your money, and he hands you a pizza, and this is the only human interaction you've had to get your hands on this pizza, you understand that there are a lot more complex things at play. There's the farmer who farmed the flour, or rather the wheat that was turned into flour. There's another farmer simultaneously farming tomatoes, someone is farming cattle, maybe, for your pizza toppings. Someone else is getting cheese from their cattle, from milk, of course. And all of these things are turned into beautiful toppings that make this lovely pizza that get to you. There's also the engineers that designed the bicycle or the motorbike that got you this pizza. They are the fuel attendants who pumped the gas that went into this. There are so many highly trained, highly educated men and women that got you this pizza today. And the illegal wildlife trade is the same, because it's not just poor poachers living near protected areas. It's a complex flurry of all sorts of highly trained, highly skilled men and women who ensure that our resources are stripped from our land and taken to places where they are worth a certain amount of money. And they will not stop. For example, earlier I was talking about how Zambia no longer has indigenous rhinos. What I didn't mention is that there are rhinos in Zambia today, because there have been efforts to start rhino populations once again. But I can't tell you anything more than that. Why? Because poachers watch TED Talks as well. They watch TEDx talks like this one, and they will know that, okay, there's a certain rhino population, I'm going to target that. They read journal articles. They find out what populations are thriving, and they now know who to target. To make this point hit home even more, last year, 2 magistrates were arrested here in Zambia for being in possession of rhino horn. So why should this matter to you today? I mean, there's lots of reasons why the illegal wildlife trade matters, why you should care, but money talks, so let's talk money. Firstly, the World Bank estimates that the illegal wildlife trade costs developing countries like Zambia $70 billion in damages every year. To put that in context, our national budget for 2019, our government expenditure was estimated to be about $9 billion. Imagine what that money could do for Zambians. Imagine the kids that could go to school. Imagine the hospitals that could be built. Imagine the curable diseases that people would not have to suffer from because we now have the resources to prevent them. Another figure, $250 million. That's how much Zambia made from tourism in the year 2017. Sounds like a lot of money, right? Well, what if I told you that Zimbabwe, in the same year, made about double that? And Botswana, also right next door, made almost 6 times that. Imagine what we could do if we had thriving wildlife populations. And lastly, when we talk about wildlife and conservation and poachers, the issue that always comes up is how is it that the people living right next to these protected areas are often the most disenfranchised? They're expected to just smile and understand when an elephant tramples their crops. They're supposed to understand that they need to protect these animals, even though they don't directly benefit from protecting them. Well, recently our government has been putting a lot of effort into community game farming. The beauty of community game farming is that it allows a community to take ownership. It can use its resources, like its land or whatever wildlife it has in that area, and partner with someone who might have money or another skill set that will enable them to create a game farm and therefore benefit directly from this wildlife. And therefore, there is less incentive to poach. And even if someone does, there's a lot more incentive to report them because they are robbing the community directly. Conserving our wildlife enables this to happen. So what can you do today to be part of the solution? I would advise starting very simply by visiting a national park. And I know you're going to say they're very far off and it costs lots of money and you don't have it. Well, there's one right here in Lusaka, and for only $2, any day of the week, you can go and visit. And while you're there, whether at Lusaka National Park or at Kafue or South Luangwa, or wherever you decide to go, talk to the rangers, to the scouts, to the wildlife police officers. Find out why it is that they put their lives on the line every single day for our wildlife. Because I think that will motivate you to take this more seriously. And after you've done that, go home. And the next time you're offered bushmeat, say no. The Department of National Parks and Wildlife currently has a campaign running to educate Zambians on the dangers of illegal bushmeat, why it's bad for you, it's bad for your family, and it's bad for the environment. And they've gone a step further. They've provided an accredited list of places where you can buy legal game meat. So ultimately, it's up to you. This is our country, this is our wildlife, and we decide what the future holds. Thank you.